Alright, so this is my new workbench, and in this video I'm going to run through how I made it. It's kind of like a hybrid MFT style workbench. The main reason I built it was essentially to hold workpieces down while I cut joinery in them, and I'm using these clamps as my main sort of method for holding stuff down to the top. They're great, they just really quickly drop into a dog hole and clamp down and hold the workpiece really tightly. And I've got these cutouts at the front as well, which really quickly allow me to just get in here with a squeezy clamp and clamp something vertically or horizontally. So it's obviously not a super fancy workbench, and it's not really meant to be, and that's kind of its appeal. It's really simple to make, it's really quick to make, and it's also really cheap. I think I spent about $150 in total on the wood, the screws, the casters, and other bits and pieces. Obviously clamps and accessories are a little bit more, but they're not too expensive. It's solid enough to be used as a hand tool bench as well, which is great, but it's not so heavy that you can't wheel it around. So it's quite mobile, which is really important for a small workshop. So yeah, it's a really good workbench, and I reckon it'll make a pretty good addition to most people's workshops. So let's get stuck in with the build.
So this whole project began with wanting to replace this dresser, which is an absolutely terrible workbench, and it's a really annoying storage unit as well. So I jumped into SketchUp just to sort of get a rough idea of what I wanted to make, and got stuck into it. I'm building this workbench from 16mm MDF. It's awful stuff to work with, but it's really cheap and it stays flat, which is perfect for a workbench. And here I'm just cutting a half sheet into quarters for the top. I'm laminating these two pieces together for the top. You could definitely get away with using one, but I really wanted a chunky top, so decided to go with the two. And I'm just throwing in a bunch of screws here just to clamp it together for the time being. One consideration for your worktop thickness is what sort of clamps you can use. The thicker you get, the less clamp options there are, but I'll get to that a little bit later on. While the top's drying, I can get started on the base, and for the legs I'm going to be doing this laminated bridle joint assembly. It's really quick and easy to put together, and it's really strong. I haven't got any plans for this workbench, but I'll put the dimensions of these legs on the screen if anyone's keen to follow along. The rest of it is really self-explanatory if you just watch the video. It's a really simple build, and I reckon most people could knock one of these together in a weekend quite easily. And I know I'm using a table saw here, but you could easily do all this with a circular saw, it just might take a bit longer. Laminating all these parts together is pretty fun. I did make a bit of a gluey mess though. I'm using brad nails here to hold everything while the glue dries. Obviously you could use screws or you could just clamp it and wait. So far this has all been fairly straightforward. The only thing to make sure of at this point is just that everything's nice and square. And it's definitely overkill, but I'm just using some screws here in the corners to make sure everything stays super strong. Moving on, I'm measuring up to cut out the bottom shelf of the bench. The dimensions of this aren't overly important, as long as it just leaves a bit of overhang on either ends of the top. And I'm just cutting out little notches here so that it slots into the legs. For the rest of this bench build, I'm just going to be using screws. It doesn't really need to be glued. For casters, I'm going to be using these self-leveling ones that have this pad that you can engage by screwing it down if you want to keep the workbench stable in the one spot. I actually picked these ones up off Marketplace, but they're pretty generic and easy to find on Amazon or eBay. And I'm adding these little squares so that I've got enough space to actually screw the casters into. Now that things are starting to come together, I can actually start using it as a workbench. I'm cutting out a piece here to use as a back panel, and that's just to add some rigidity and some extra support for the top. Again, the dimensions of this doesn't really matter as long as it's more or less as wide as what you can see here. And now that the top's dried, I'm just trimming this down so that everything's nice and square and neat. I'm cutting out a piece here for the front panel, and I can't actually remember exactly why I put it on at this stage, but I think it must have just been to help line everything up moving forward. So I was umming and ahhing for quite a while about what style of top to use. I was thinking initially about using T-Track, then about potentially using the micro jig match fit system, and I ended up deciding on dog holes because I think it's the quickest way of clamping a piece down. You've got the most versatility about what sort of accessories you can use, and I think it's actually ultimately cheaper than the other options as well. I was happy enough to just measure out these hole spacings. They may not be 100% accurately laid out, but I couldn't think of a good reason to make them perfectly spaced, and for my use of this workbench, it doesn't really matter. For this lower section of the workbench, you could really add whatever you want. I've opted for this shelf situation here, which I'm going to add a drawer underneath it, but you could add a whole fleet of drawers or you could have it open. It doesn't really matter. I got this plywood for free from a construction site. They were just throwing it out. It's pretty banged up, and as you can see, it's got some paint on it, but it's perfectly fine for shop furniture. And I'm just using it to make a single large drawer, which I'm planning on storing some larger jigs and templates in. And it's a really basic drawer construction, so I'll just race through it. And I'm adding this little block at the back so that the drawer has something to stop against. Earlier I mentioned that the thickness of the top should be considered when you're deciding on what sort of clamp system you're going to use. I'd planned on using tracks or clamps, and I knew that I'd have to add a big bevel to the underside of the dog holes for the clamps to fit through, but annoyingly my bit wasn't quite big enough, so I ended up going with these style of clamps instead, which work fine. I'm adding cutouts to the front panel so that I can clamp work pieces with quick clamps to the front. I didn't do the neatest job of this, but it really doesn't matter and it still looks fine. I'm adding a little chamfer to the top of the dog holes. That's just to neaten things up and just to take the sharp edge off it. And finally I could screw the top to the base. I didn't film it, but I added a few blocks of hardwood to the front panel just so that I had something to screw into, otherwise it would have split. And to finish it off, I added a couple of coats of water-based polyurethane. And after adding a few storage solutions for my bench dogs and clamps, this workbench was done. So I've been using this bench now for about 2 or 3 months and I've really enjoyed it. It's been fantastic. And to see it more in action, you're gonna have to stick around and watch some more of my videos.